Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with the next chapter in A. Edward Newton's This Book Collecting Game. This is called The Auction Room. There are a lot of proverbs and cant phrases designed to tell you what kind of man the other fellow is. One immediately occurs to me. A man is known by the company he keeps. But if one wants to know what kind of fellow he himself is, he can hardly do better than watch himself function in the auction room. The result will hardly be pleasing. The first time I went to an auction in the private house of an acquaintance, I outbid a man I didn't like for several items I had no use for, including a filthy, dilapidated refrigerator and a bedstead so large that I could not get it into the room which I had in mind when I bought it. Then it was that I discovered that I was of a mean, covetous, and acquisitive disposition. What my wife said of that refrigerator I shall not print, and I can see that bedstead now across a chasm of years. It was a huge black walnut affair with festoons of flowers, fruit, and thorn pieces cut out and glued upon the headboard in a style which we now disdainfully call early Victorian. The refrigerator I gave to the man hired to haul it, and the mattress which came with the bed, for excellent reasons, were burned. The services of a carpenter with a saw were required before the bedstead and monstrosity could be brought into the house, and finally we had a supply of fine, expensive kindling. And to this day, when I see some poor wretch, as he invariably seems to be, bidding against me for something I don't in the least need, I feel an evil spirit rising within me, and hardly need the encouraging smile of the auctioneer urging me on to something very like destruction. To me the auction room is a flame, and I am a moth, and how I singe my wings. Theoretically and superficially, an auction sale, whether it be of a railroad sold under foreclosure of a mortgage from the steps of some county courthouse, or a lot of rugs disposed of under the blaze of artificial light between the dark velvet curtains, is about the fairest way of buying and selling any given piece of merchandise there is, but actually, caveat emptor, things are not always what they seem. In old times a bell was rung announcing that the sale was about to begin, but if the auctioneer, who wanted to begin and end the sale in favor of some particular bidder, rang the bell in his pocket so that it was not heard, and knocked down the property before most people knew that the sale was on, what then? And what is to prevent a knockout and a dozen other forms of iniquity? There are tricks all in trades, and the auction game is fuller of tricks than most. I know what I know, and it has cost me something to learn. For what information we have of the first book auctions, we are indebted to John Lawler, sometimes chief book cataloguer of the ancient firm of Sotheby. He, with tireless patience and rare knowledge, compiled a little book on the subject, from which we learn that the first auctioneer in England was William Cooper, a bookseller living in 1676 at the sign of the Pelican in Little Britain. Little Britain is a district just back of Bartholomew's Hospital in London. In Cooper's preface to his first catalogue, he says, "Hath not been usual here in England to make sale of books by way of auction, or who will give most for them, but it hath been practised in other countries, to the advantage of both buyers and sellers, and it is hoped that this way will not be unacceptable to scholars." The catalogue in which this statement appeared was that of Dr. Lazarus Seaman, a prominent theologian of the city of London, whose library of 15 or 20,000 volumes fetched a total of about £3,000. It is hardly worth our while to comment upon these halcyon days, those halcyon days, that golden age is gone, when an Indian Bible of John Eliot could be had for 19 shillings and the Homer of 1488 for 9. But if Cooper was the first and Millington the most important of the early auctioneers, John Dutton, author, printer, bookseller, auctioneer, and traveller, was the most interesting. He was born in 1659, and his autobiography, The Life and Errors of John Dutton, will well repay reading. Should not the life of every man be called his life and errors? It was the late Clement Shorter, the ardent book collector and editor of the Sphere, who first called my attention to this curious book, which is very little known. Dutton learned to love women and books at the same time, in his 14th year, and he early adventured with both. He claims to have published 600 books, which is of course nonsense, but he published a great many, and if he held no auction sales in England, he held many in Ireland. When a depression fell upon the book trade at home, he promptly sailed for Boston, leaving his wife Elizabeth, whom he affectionately called Iris, behind him. Absence endears a wife was one of his maxims. Many men have unconsciously adopted it. In Boston, where he says £500 was owing him, he was well received, and he visited the eminent divines that were then sprouting vigorously in the rocky soil of New England. But he does not appear to have collected the money, or if he did, he spent it, for on his return home he was sought by bailiffs, and to escape arrest, kept within doors for almost a year, finally escaping to Holland, and what is now Germany. But this is a digression. In 1764, Henry Fielding's library was sold. Books filled with his autographed notes brought but a few shillings each, and 5 volumes of legal manuscripts in his own handwriting, only 13 shillings. Contrast such prices with £1,000 and odd pounds, which the novelist's agreement with Andrew Miller for the copyright of Tom Jones brought a few years ago, and what would Fielding have said had he been told that the day would come when a man would pay Charles Cessler $3,000 for a copy of his immortal novel in boards uncut? Skip we the intervening sales between 1781, when the noble library of Topham Beauclerk was disposed of. A copy of the sale catalogue is before me. It lists over 30,000 volumes, in most languages and upon almost every branch of science and polite literature. Beauclerk, it will be remembered, was a great-grandson of Charles II, out of Nell Gwyn, as the stud book says, but it was one of his learning and charm, but it was for his learning and charm and wit that Dr. Johnson hobnobbed with him, and went with him and Bennet Langton on the famous outing that Boswell records. I love the story. It will be remembered that the philosopher was once awakened about 3 a.m. by 2 men knocking at his door. They had been dining together at a nearby tavern. Johnson thought he was being attacked by burglars and came downstairs armed with a heavy poker. But upon discovering that they were his friends and learning that they wanted him to join them, he became good-humored at once, and, dressing, sallied forth upon a frisk. They went to Covent Gardens, where Johnson offered his services to the greengrocers and fruitiers, which were declined. Then they went to a tavern and had a bowl of bishop. Afterward they went on a boat and had a row upon the river. And finally it was suggested that they should join the ladies. But Johnson would go no farther, and scolded his friends for deserting him to go and sit with a set of wretched, un-ID'd girls. Beauclerk was only 40 when he died, and Johnson was disconsolate at his passing. Poor dear Beauclerk, he wrote to Boswell, his wit, his folly, his acuteness, and his maliciousness, his merriment and reasoning are now over. Such another will not often be found. I was quite overjoyed when, some years ago, I stumbled upon several volumes from Beauclerk's library and a priced copy of his sales catalogue. Books from a man's library invariably bring you close to the man himself. I felt that I had been one of the company on the river. It took 49 days to dispose of the library, and it would take almost as long to locate any sought-for item in the catalogue, owing to the violent and arbitrary method of arrangement, which to some extent continues in English book auction catalogues to this very day. We have here a catalogue. Library of Books of the late learned Samuel Johnson. My next catalogue is that of the Library of Books of the late learned Samuel Johnson, Esquire, LL.D., which was sold by Mr. Christie in his great room in Pall Mall on Wednesday, February 16, 1785, and 3 following days. The copy before me formerly belonged to General Oglethorpe, a friend of Dr. Johnson's. At the sale of his effects, it passed to Samuel Lysons, the antiquarian, and subsequently it became the property of the eminent Jonesian scholar and collector, Colonel Grant, at whose sale, in May 1900, it fetched £25, 10 shillings. I made a facsimile reprint of a copy of the sale catalogue of Dr. Johnson's library several years ago, not of my copy, but another one, the property of my friend, Colonel Ralph Isham. Isham's catalogue is more interesting than mine, if it has a less distinguished provenance, for the reason that, in his copy, not only are the prices of the books fetched marked in ink, but the names of the buyers are given also. May I quote from the foreword I published as an introduction to the little volume? It was written in the attic room of Dr. Johnson's house in Grosvenor Square, the room in which the dictionary was written. The catalogue of Dr. Johnson's library. Our book collecting then all comes to this. A man spends freely of his time, his money, and his energy, and dies, and ere he is cold in his grave, enter his executors with power to act and sell under the hammer of the auctioneer, the books which once were part and parcel of the man himself. Certainly the disposal of a man's library should be undertaken as reverently as the disposal of his corpse, which in some sort his library is. Of those who attended the sale, how many kept their catalogues? Perhaps only a handful escaped immediate destruction. Certainly only one or two persons could have been sufficiently interested to indicate in ink the prices which the items fetched and the people who paid for them, and then put the catalogue away so carefully that it is preserved to us. One cannot say with any certainty that this is the worst book catalogue ever made, but the mere sight of it, I am told, made my friend Mitchell Kernley, he of the Anderson Galleries in New York, so ill that, but never mind. Let us agree that the books were not over-catalogued. There were not a great many volumes, about 3,000 in all. What has become of them? What has become of the little volumes which someone saw with the inscription, "This was dear Teddy's book"? Teddy was the doctor's wife, it will be remembered. What book was it? What was the condition of the first folio of Shakespeare that it brought only £1 2s? Doubtless it was imperfect. Perhaps it was disfigured by his owner's notes. What would not one give to own it? Was the Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy the identical copy that served as an alarm clock and got the doctor out of bed 2 hours earlier than he wished to rise? My copy, and mine is a first edition in pristine condition, puts me to sleep as quickly as an opiate. That is what I keep it for. It was a very miscellaneous collection of books that the doctor gathered about him. He did not treat them well, it will be remembered, but tore their hearts out. When he sought to borrow a book from Garrick, who had a pretty taste in books and bindings, he shuddered, but he could give excellent advice on the subject of book collecting, as he did on everything else. Let us allow our imagination to play for a moment and fancy that this library, dispersed 140 years ago, could be reassembled and resold today at Mitchell Kernley's Anderson Galleries in New York, and that the items in bundles were separated and properly described and catalogued, as he would certainly do the job. What competition there would be, what prices those books would fetch, what great room would hold the throng. Kit Morley would write another "What am I bid?" said the auctioneer poem, and I should be a bankrupt. Things are better as they are. I am glad this library was disaverted. It is Gabriel Wells' words when it was. The last old auction catalogue that I shall refer to is that of James Boswell, Jr. James Boswell, the biographer, died in 1795. We know that he was a hoarding animal and that, in the preparation of his Life of Johnson, he had accumulated a great mass of letters, journals, data of all kinds, which it was his intention should be kept forever in the archives at his ancestral home at Auchinleck. But in some ways the legend arose that at his death all, or almost all, of his material was immediately destroyed. All the great Johnsonians, Croker and Hill and Sir Leslie Stephen, even that impeccable scholar R.W. Chapman, seem to have been of this opinion. But little by little items of interest have been seeping into the market. Some came from the sale of his son's library, which was sold at auction by Mr. Sotheby at his house in Wellington Street, Strand, in 1825. His catalogue is before me, but, owing to the archaic method of listing books by size, it is not too easy to refer to. Moreover, an item, "Tracts Poetical 10 volumes," may mean anything or nothing, and there are many such entries. Birbeck's Hill is our authority for the statement of that. Boswell's descendants were much ashamed of their ancestors' intimacy with the lexicographer, and determined to ignore it as much as possible. Immediately upon the death of Boswell, the biographer, his fine portrait of Johnson by Reynolds, was sent into the lumber room, and Hill himself, 100 years later, was refused admission to Auchinleck when he called. In an interesting paper, he tells us how, when Boswell's daughter heard that he was publishing what she called another edition of the Life of Johnson, containing some new material, she wrote and asked him whence it came. This may be as good a place as any to refer to the fact that an immense amount of Boswell material came unexpectedly to the surface in Dublin a year or two ago, and was secured after much negotiation by Ralph Isham, who promises that it shall be published when it has been digested and edited. I should like to tell the whole story of this interesting discovery, but it is not mine to tell. Suffice to say that it is the most important literary find that has occurred in many years. Old catalogues are very provocative. Reynolds' portrait of Johnson, which had on Boswell's death been removed from his living apartments, in disgrace, brought at the auction sale of his son in London £76 13s, while a portrait of Boswell himself, a 3/4 length, I wonder what it was, brought £11 6. In all, about 150 Johnson items were sold at this sale, and doubtless a large number of pieces, which now adorn the library of my friend R.B. Adam of Buffalo, must originally have been the property of Boswell Jr. But I have not had the patience to track them down. One would like to know the present whereabouts of the original draft for the plan of the dictionary entirely in Johnson's handwriting, which brought 17s 6. It was bought by Thorpe, who was a large buyer, and it is interesting to see that 7 holograph prayers brought 9 guineas for the lot, one of which finally passed into the Oak Knoll Library, as did also the first edition of Boswell's Johnson, with an inscription to James Boswell, Esquire, Jr., from his affectionate father, the author. At Boswell's sale it brought £1 16, and 10 years later, when John Murray, Byron's Murray, bought it, he had it extra illuminated. He paid, as a note in his handwriting records, £2 10. But to return to the auction room, one of the most intriguing books I know of on the subject of auction prices was published in 1901 by the late William Harris Arnold, under the caption, A Record of Books and Letters. First, let it be said that Mr. Arnold was never a rich, but always a very astute man. About the year 1895, he decided that he would seriously and systematically purchase all the fine books, within certain limits, that he could afford, in the belief that, should he ever desire to sell them, he could do so at a profit. But his chief profit, as he told me, was to be the pleasure of the chase. He began by a systematic study of booksellers and auction catalogues. He worked at his hobby day and night, and after 6 years he stopped as suddenly as he began and disposed of his books. At auction, or who will give most for them? He bought both English and American first editions, and published the result of his venture in 2 handsome and now scarce volumes, entitled respectively A Record of Books and Letters, A Record of First Editions of American Authors, printed at the Marion Press, Jamaica. The books were sold in the winter and spring of 1901 by Messrs. Bangs and Company, the then fashionable New York auctioneers. I have said that Mr. Arnold was very astute. He was, but he would have been even more astute had he not disposed of either of his collections, notwithstanding the fact that he immediately began collecting another library which was not dispersed until after his death. His records are before me as I write. They are practically reprints of the sales catalogue, very handsomely printed, giving in parallel columns the cost of each item in red ink, with the price it fetched at auction in black. A finer volume to place in your wife's hands, if and when she complains of the prices you are paying for books never before existed. The totals run, cost for the English authors, $10,066.05, selling price $19,743.50. For a picked list of Americans, cost $3,508.16, selling price $7,363.17, or a total profit of $13,532.46, which was certainly very gratifying as the result of a game which was entered into rather for the pleasure of the chase and for its cultural value than with the idea of making a profit. There are a lot of concerns selling bonds which are too easily disposed of, should you wish to turn them into money, who advertise pretty freely, 20 years or more or less, without loss to any investor. A good conscientious bookseller could say the same thing, provided his customer bought enough books and was satisfied to average. In no other sport can you eat your cake and have it with anything like the same certainty as in this book collecting game. Mr. Arnold's list begins, as so many of our American catalogues begin, with the entry Andrews, W.L., a short historical sketch of the art of bookbinding. It cost him $1.50, and he got $34 for it. This might be called a flying start. The first 9 items in his record were Andrews, and the total cost was $91. The selling price of 390 Andrews books were very fashionable. They would not fetch as much today, as there are fashions in book collecting as in everything else. Mr. Arnold did almost equally well with his keeps. A presentation copy of the poems, which, with an inscription in the poet's hand, My dear Giovanni, I hope your eyes will soon be well enough to read this with pleasure and ease. Cost him $71 and brought 500. But what would it bring today? As I write these lines, a copy in boards without any inscription, back somewhat worn, small piece missing, brought last night at the American Art Association the amazing price of $3,300. And perhaps by the time these lines are read, this figure will be exceeded. Mr. Arnold's Tom Jones, an original calf, cost him $28 and sold for $33. It was not a scarce book then, but $500 would not be an excessive price today. The 18th century is coming into its own. He had a copy of what was then termed the second edition of Goldsmith's Deserted Village, 1770, Morocco-bound, gilt on the rough, the only copy known. Whenever one comes across the phrase, the only copy known, it is well to consult Wise. If his valuable catalogue is available, and the item is within his range, as it is in this instance, and this is what he says with omissions. The first edition, privately printed, the origin of this edition still remains obscure. If a note made by Bishop Percy may be relied upon, it probably may. The pamphlet was produced before the close of 1769. The succeeding edition in quarto did not appear until May 1770. Of the 12º, 7 by 4 1/2 inches, only 5 examples have as yet been traced. Mr. Wise's copy is uncut. It would be, of course. But this little nugget Mr. Arnold paid $33 for and sold it for $190. Years ago I paid a London bookseller £30 for mine, and a copy sold recently for $450. Mr. Arnold had a copy of Dr. Johnson's Dictionary in boards, uncut. He paid something over $15 for it and sold it for $76. Some years later I bought the same identical book from A.J. Bowden for $38. The name of Bowden carries me back many years. He was a remarkable man. Born in England, he came to this country with better mental equipment than any man that played the rare book game. He had knowledge, a wonderful memory, was integrity itself, and he had courage and skill. But he had a sad failing. When most needed, he was not to be found. Everyone trusted his judgment, but no one could with safety entrust him with his commissions. For this reason, he frequently played a lone hand, and sometimes he played it well. He would buy a book for $5, sell it for $50, and then take a drink, and then another drink, not book. His great coup was in Philadelphia in 1890, when I first came to know him. In that year, there was an auction sale of some personal effects of the Washington family, including the family Bible of Martha Washington. By some mischance, the item had been omitted from the catalog, but as the sale of it had been otherwise announced, it was decided to sell it, and a reserve price of $750 was put upon it. The bidding opened, and Bowden bidding $750, and as there were no other bidders, the book was knocked down to him, much to the amusement of those present. Whereupon he arose and made a speech. He said he was an Englishman, but he seemed to remember the name of Washington as that of a man who at one time had been prominent in the affairs of his country. He thought it remarkable that the bookseller present had left it to him, an Englishman, to properly appreciate the value of a Washington family Bible. And he said that his price for the book was $5,000. Before he left the auction room, he was offered $1,800 for his bargain, but he stuck to his original price and got it from C.F. Gunther of Chicago. He was very fond of Bowden. I was very fond of Bowden, received many letters, and bought a good many books from him. His judgment and integrity were unquestioned and unquestionable. George D. Smith relied very largely on his knowledge at the time of the wholesale, and he once tried to induce me to keep Bowden sober during the time of the sale, but I did not feel equal to the task. The last time I saw him was shortly before his death. We met in Fifth Avenue one afternoon and walked up the street together, he more or less under the influence of liquor, the picture of misery, and I not very. I never think of this fine old bookman without the recollection of a retort he once made to a very sanctimonious member of the trade, who told him that he did not look like a bookseller or talk like a bookseller. He did not even smell like a bookseller. "Why, blank," replied Bowden, "do you want to know why I'm a bookseller? It's on account of its goddamned refining influence." It is interesting to watch someone special. It is interesting to watch one special item in its flight from one man's collection to another. Here is a fascinating letter from Goldsmith to Garrick, relating to the first production of She Stooped to Conquer. I first noticed it in the famous Morrison sale of autographs in London some years ago. And here we have a reproduction of that letter. From London it went to Paris, then back to London, then to New York, and at last it finds a resting place. For how long? In the library at Oak Knoll. It is not my intention to refer to any detail of the important book auction sales held in this country prior to the Hoe sale, although it might be interesting to linger over the John Allen sale, which was held in New York in the spring of 1864. Allen had supposed that his books would fetch about $12,000. They actually brought a trifle less than $38,000, although it was during the Civil War and the sale was several times interrupted by the passing regiment of soldiers in the street to the accompaniment of drum and fife. One of the high spots of the sale was an Eliot Bible, for which a few years before Allen had unwisely squandered, as his friends thought, $210. It brought $825, while his Killamrock Burns brought $106. The George Brinley sale held in March 1879, I remember hearing much spoken of the time, as I was then working in the stationery department at Porter & Coates, not having, it was thought, sufficient intelligence to enter the book department. There were 2,700 items in this sale, and the total realized was just under $50,000. It would be interesting to guess how many millions it would fetch today. The collection was largely Americana, and in no other line has there been such an amazing appreciation. But the record is held, and it is likely to be held by the Hoe sale, which began at the Anderson Galleries on April 24, 1911. It was this sale which made Mr. Henry E. Huntington the premier book collecting of the world. George D. Smith was at the height of his fame, and Dr. Rosenbach's day had not yet come. In the front row of the crowded auction room sat George, with Mr. Huntington on one side of him, and frequently Bowden on the other. Harry Widener and I just behind him. Mr. Huntington once told me how he had bought huge blocks of real estate in a western city contiguous to a great railroad terminal he was building when a parcel turned up. He bought it at whatever was the price. He never haggled. He bought books at the Hoe sale in the same way, and some of us who were chiefly engaged in watching the proceedings wondered at the nonchalance with which GDS, representing him, took the star items, seemingly regardless of price. But what was the result? Mr. Huntington got the books he wanted, and at low prices, which now seem ridiculously low. I have attended many auction sales, both here and abroad, and I infinitely prefer the atmosphere of the New York auction room to that of London. An important sale, either at Anderson's or the American Art, is a social event. The sales are usually held after dinner and are attended by a good many men in evening dress, who are accompanied by ladies. The booksellers, numbering perhaps 30 or 40 men, are seemingly on good terms with each other. But actually there is the keenest competition among them. Their camaraderie is purely superficial. They are there to buy books. In London, on the other hand, the auction room, like those who frequent it, seems to be very astir. No fellow feeling, making wondrous kind, is apparent, and yet a knockout, which is a form of villainy practically unknown in this country, may be and probably is in operation. The knockout cannot be explained too fully or too often. At country sales it functions, I should say always, at important sales in London, not infrequently. The knockout operates in this way. A group of booksellers, or it may be dealers in pictures, furniture, silver, or whatnot, having attended sales together for many years, and knowing each other well, go to a sale at which one man will buy all the items of a certain class, another man will buy in another class, and so throughout the sale. There is not the slightest competition. After the public sale is over, there is another auction, this time a very exclusive affair, at which the books are resold, and the price they fetch, above the price originally paid, is divided up among those present according to some prearranged formula. It frequently happens that a man receives a very handsome sum of money merely for being among those present. He does not buy a single book, and if by some mischance a stranger enters the public sale, He is so severely disciplined by the trade that he is not allowed to have it except perhaps at a price which will make him hate himself and it forever. Quite frequently, when one has sent one's bid abroad to some eminent house, Kortrijk, for example, and subsequently reads in the paper that the book has been sold at or considerably below his bid, he is disappointed at not getting the item. The price given in the paper was a fictitious one, the book having been again sold in the knockout, may have brought a large advance on the ostentatious price. The owner at the estate selling the book was cheated, it may be, out of half of the value of the library disposed of. It was to avoid the possible operation of the knockout that the executors at the Hoe estate decided to sell the great library in New York rather than in London, where the dispersal of the library by a rich American might have been as slaughter as was the Van Antwerp sale, which took place at Sotheby's in 1907. A priced copy of the Van Antwerp sales catalogue is before me as I write, and while much water has gone over the dam since this small but lovely library was sold, it requires only a few moments' study to see that some sinister influence was at work. The same identical presentation copy of Keats' poems, which Mr. Arnold had bought for $71 and sold for $500 6 years before, brought only £90, and Milton's Comus, now appraised at $25,000, brought less than $800. One would suppose that some sense of honesty would operate to terminate the operations of the knockout, but established customs die hard in England, and it will take legislation to kill it, and this may be coming. Only a few days ago, Lord Darling, familiar to us for so many years as Mr. Justice Darling, introduced a bill to make illegal any agreement not to bid at an auction sale in competition with any other person, so that the property may be acquired afterwards by the person making the agreement. Anyone entering into such an agreement shall be liable on conviction to a fine not exceeding £100 or 6 months' imprisonment or both. In the discussion that followed, someone representing the Incorporated Society of Auctioneers said the knockout was regularly resorted to by various classes of dealers, and that auctioneers were helpless against these combinations. While it would be difficult, he said, to stop private arrangements between two or more dealers, the proposed act would considerably reduce the activities of the ring. Of course, no one hates the knockouts more than the auctioneers themselves, as their profits depend upon the price at which the merchandise is sold. Be that merchandise what it may, the whole knockout idea is a development of the old guild or trade union spirit. A man who has not served his apprenticeship in the trade must keep out of it. The romance of the auction room has never been written, and it never can be. It would be too full of thrills for the human mind to stand, and it would make the checkered career of Nellie the Beautiful cloak model commonplace. Priceless items go for almost nothing. Not often, certainly, but sometimes. Not long ago, at an important sale in London, a batch of sheet music tied together with a string was bought by Joseph at Charing Cross Road for £3, and he sold it to Thorpe of Guildford for £25. Did anyone surmise that the bundle contained a copy of the excessively rare Shelley item, the posthumous fragments of Margaret Nicholson? No, but it did, and after it was changed hands several times, Gabriel Wells sold it a few weeks later in New York for $8,000. Was it possible that some dishonest employee of the auction house, knowing the value of the item, planted it in a lot of worthless sheet music, that someone in the know might buy it? I hope not, but the incident attracted so much attention that Messrs. Hodgson and Son of Chancery Lane felt impelled to write the Bookman's Journal, saying that this particular copy had not passed through their hands. At auction in this country there are 3 ways of procedure. One may bid oneself. This is fairly dangerous, for if the item is important, the whole room is against you. One may entrust one's bid to the auctioneer. This may be folly. I recently heard of an example of this at a certain sale. There were 4 copies of the same identical book listed under 4 separate numbers in the catalogue. A friend of mine sent a bid to the auctioneer for, say, $8 for the 3rd copy to be sold. The first copy sold brought $3, the second copy $2.50, and the 3rd copy $8, and the 4th $3, whereupon my friend addressed a letter to the auctioneer asking what had happened, and received a reply stating that it was a coincidence that they could not explain naturally. The 3rd and best way is to place your bid with a reliable bookseller. This is not as simple as it sounds. It requires intelligence and courage. One has to make up one's mind who is likely to have a commission for the coveted item. Then he should go to the bookseller and say, "Buy that item for me," up to the highest price he is willing to pay. At this point, the negotiation becomes delicate. The bookseller may say, "That ought to bring it," or he may say, having already a higher bid or knowing of one, "You haven't a chance at that figure." Or he may say, "Leave it to me," or he may say anything or nothing, and anything may happen. Auctions are like the weather, uncertain. If Wall Street is booming, prices are certain to be high for good items. If Wall Street is depressed or in a panic, and such things happen, prices are almost certain to be low, except for items which must be bought now or never. The great thing is to make the right selection of your agent, and do not grudge against him his 10% commission. By the selection of the wrong man to do the bidding, I have frequently seen thousands of dollars thrown away. And in an effort to save $10,000, I saw a man at Anderson's lose the Gutenberg Bible that was sold there on February 15th, 1926, at about 10:30 in the evening. This was an historic occasion. It was at the end of the first night of the R.B. Adams sale, and the room was packed. It was well known that a certain very rich man was prepared to pay a stiff price for the famous volume, and that it was his intention to give it to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. The presentation had all but taken place. What happened? The last copy had been bought by a very astute collector for about $65,000 from Dr. Rosenbach, and it was a gift at that price. No one knew whether Dr. R. had or had not a commission for it, but I was perfectly certain that he would buy this copy, be the price what it would. The book was put up, a few words were said to Mr. Kennerly, not many were needed. The bidding began at $50,000 all round the room. Rosie did not bid. It seemed to be a battle between Gabriel Wells and a certain rich man, whom I shall designate by the initials C.R.M. Wells, dropped out. C.R.M. Wells dropped out at $75,000, and C.R.M. thought the book his at $76,000, but he had still to reckon with Dr. R., who bid $80,000, as who should say, "Let's be done with the matter." Whereupon C.R.M. bid $85,000, and so the bidding went on by $1,000 and by $5,000, until at last C.R.M. bid $105,000, Dr. R. $106,000. That settled it, and C.R.M. had the same distinction that I had, that of not getting the book. At the fall of the hammer there was a buzz all around the room. No book had ever brought such a price. Was Dr. R. acting for himself, or did he have a buyer? Guesses were numerous, but as usual wrong. A few days later, President Angle made the announcement that Mrs. Harkness had permanently enriched the library at Yale by the gift of a Gutenberg Bible. Dr. R. had acted with his usual shrewdness. He had no commission for the book. Mrs. Harkness was in California, but he had immediately communicated with her by telegraph, and before the smoke had cleared from the battlefield, the book had been delivered and paid for. The chances are 10 to 1 that had not C.R.M. sought to save a 10% commission, had he given his bid to Dr. R., that book would have been his at anywhere from $75,000 to $80,000. It was the finest exhibition of how not to bid I have ever seen. In recent years, there has been much to do over the autograph of Button Gwinnett, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. People collect signers with a rigor unknown in any other game. Men must have the Button Gwinnett to complete their collections. Gwinnett was an Englishman who came over here and settled in Georgia as a trader. In 1770, he bought a plantation and gave himself over to the life of a farmer. He always took an important part in the life of the colony, however, and was elected a member of the legislature and sent as a delegate to the Continental Congress, where he signed the Declaration. While he was busy with the business of a rebellion, the British seized his property and destroyed it, and in 1777 he met a tragic end. His great ambition was a commission of brigadier general. He was defeated for the post by a Captain Mackintosh. From that moment, Mackintosh became his sworn enemy, and he challenged him to a duel, and on the morning of May 15, 1777, it was fought. Both men were severely wounded, Mackintosh recovered, and Gwinnett died at the age of 45. Why are his signatures so scarce? That is one of the mysteries of Americana. Gwinnett lived in his country for more than 12 years. He was a merchant and must have signed many papers, receipts, and things of that sort, and he must have written letters, yet today only 40 of his signatures are known to exist, and only one of these is attached to a letter. No one knows these facts better than Dr. R. I sat next to him at the famous Thomas sale in Philadelphia. in November 1924, when he paid the record price of $14,000 for this elusive signature. When I congratulated him on his purchase, he said, "I have one in New York which I have been trying to sell for $10,000. Do you mind stepping to the telephone and saying that it is not to be sold at any price? I shall now ask $20,000 for it." And he did, and got it, and within a year he paid $22,500 for another, with Madigan as the underbidder. 10 years ago, when Colonel Manning paid $4,600 for our Gwinnett, people called him a madman, but today the experts say that within 5 years, $50,000 will look cheap. People want to complete their collections of signers. No one can complete his Shakespeare or many other things, but with the signers in many cases, it is only a Gwinnett that is lacking, hence the price. I have no more desire to complete my collection of anything than I have to complete my life. I have no collection that can be completed. I should be glad to have an 1865 Alice, but if I cannot get it, I shall be content with my 1903 Dynasts, or with my Goldsmith letter, or my Treasure Island map. For the omnivorous collector, there are plenty of thrills left. Immediately after any great auction sale, the dealers, in whatever it may be, are very busy. Such an item fetched so much at the sale last night, they say. The woman who hesitates is lost, the man who deliberates loses. This chapter was written several years ago and put aside. All the prices mentioned look silly today, as those of today will certainly look silly a few years hence. It is the functioning of the law of supply and demand, a constantly increasing demand and a decreasing supply. We had to wait only a year to see a button Gwinnett bring $51,000, and a few weeks ago when Dr. Rosenbach in London paid £15,400 for the manuscript of Alice, there was at once a great hue and cry. The manuscript ought not to leave England, they said, whereupon Rosie offered it to the nation at cost and promised a subscription of £1,000. Catch Rosie asleep. He is the greatest bookseller that the world has ever seen. I could prove it, but in Dr. Johnson's phrase, I expect some statements to be accepted without proof. Naturally, his rivals will not agree. In April 1925, George Barr McCutcheon sold his fine collection of Hardy, Kipling, and Stevenson. There has not been a good Hardy sale recently, and it is useless to speculate as to what good items would now fetch, now that the ashes of the great Victorian have been placed in the Poet's Corner of Westminster Abbey. But there are two items which may be called the cornerstone and the capstone, respectively, of any Hardy collection. The first is Desperate Remedies, Hardy's first book, which was published anonymously in 1871 in bright red cloth. Of this book, John C. Eccles says, "It is almost impossible to find in even fair condition. Usually copies are offered which have been under the book surgeon's care. Soiled covers, to say nothing of substituted end papers and restored and strengthened backs, are the attributes of the 3 volumes when they now appear." The first Desperate Remedies sold at auction in this country in many years was the fine McCutcheon copy. One of the 2 letters tipped in was written by the author concerning the book, in which he stated that the very first copies were in green cloth, issued about Easter 1871. It was nearly snuffed out. I think that on its revival the volumes remaining in sheets were bound up in different colors. No copy in green cloth has ever reached the surface so far as I know. The 3 volumes at the sale brought $2,100. A Western dealer recently offered a copy for $2,750, while Gannon in New York has just sold a very fine copy to Paul Hyde Bonner for a price said to exceed $4,000. It is potentially a $10,000 book. The capstone is the Dynasts. The accepted first edition of the first volume is dated 1904, but very few copies were published with the date 1903. And here we have a title page from that book. The McCutcheon copy was the 1903 issue and was presented to Algernon C. Swinburne with the best wishes of Thomas Hardy. It brought $2,100. A year ago, a copy without an inscription fetched $2,100 and was bought by Dr. Rosenbach for my friend and rival Barton W. Curry. It may well be that a fine presentation copy like the McCutcheon copy would today bring $10,000. I began collecting Hardy 30 years ago, when presentation copies could be had for $10 or $15. but this is a very small compensation for being an old man. In the case of Kipling, we are on safer ground, for as recently as January 16th, 1928, there was a Kipling sale at the American Art Association in New York, at which seemingly fantastic prices were paid, but prices have always been fantastic. No copy of The Smith Administration was in the sale, but a few weeks before a copy had been sold for $14,000, whereas a year before my friend Ellis Ames Ballard had paid only $4,600 for it. I have heard it said that the Ballard collection is unsurpassed either in this country or in England. It would seem, if one can judge the future by the past, and how else can it be judged, that it is always too soon to sell, at auction or in any other way, and keep your duplicates. I made a mistake in selling some of mine at the sale of the books of a busted bibliophile in New York a few years ago. Good prices were realized, but I missed the books sadly. Indeed, it is not until a man can look upon at least 2 copies of his favorite book on his shelves that he can call himself a real collector. Herber, the great English bibliophile, insisted upon 3, but I always thought that was a little extreme. And so that brings us to the end of this chapter on auctions.